Next panel is the future of NATO. We've talked about NATO quite a bit already today, but this panel is going to dive deeply into it. And no better person to moderate than my longtime friend and colleague, Kurt Volker. Kurt.
All right. David, thank you very much. I'll say a couple words of introduction, and then we'll introduce our panel here. First word of introduction is that you should feel free to take off your jackets. It's not going to get cooler anytime soon. So I'm leading by example here, and I encourage you to be comfortable.
As diplomats, don't we?
Second thing, the title of this panel in the schedule here is The Future of NATO. Well, I first started working on NATO issues, I just did the math, 34 years ago. I was working on the CFE treaty in the State Department, commuting to NATO about every 2 weeks. And I think for every single one of those 34 years, there has been a conference entitled The Future of NATO. And for the first time, I actually feel like it's an appropriate title. Because I think, and I'm going to go back to something that Ola Shamshor said at one of the early sessions this morning. He said people are having a hard time thinking about Ukraine's role in NATO because they're having a hard time thinking about the end game of the conflict, end game of the war. I think that's exactly right, and I would make a bigger point. People are having a hard time thinking about the future of Europe and what it's going to be because they have a hard time imagining what it's going to look like at the end of this conflict. I think that we are woefully behind in our thinking. That, in my view, with, as you mentioned earlier today too, but with Putinism out there, as an imperialist, genocidal, and authoritarian system that threatens all of Europe, yes, it's manifesting itself in Ukraine today, but there won't be security, peace, freedom, democracy in Europe as long as that regime is there doing what it does. And if NATO is going to do its job is the defense of security of its members in Europe, the only way it can do this is if Ukraine is a member of NATO, if the gray zones, including Georgia and Moldova, are closed, and we actually create a secure space in Europe again. So the future of NATO, in my book, is only assured if we actually think much further ahead about membership for all of those countries in the gray zones. And, as the conference is entitled, the end of Putinism. That's what will restore peace. So with that, we have a wonderful panel here. People who are bringing their own different perspectives toward the issue of the future of NATO. And I want to go through and introduce first, we have Benedetta Berti. She is the head of policy planning at NATO, has been around the organization for a long time. I remember her from when I was there, which goes back. Ian Bond, former British diplomat, ambassador with the Center for European Reform. Jonas Hafström, senior Swedish diplomat, former diplomatic advisor to Prime Minister's, former ambassador to the United States, rector at Lund University. And Žygimantas Pavilionis, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Lithuanian Parliament, and also a former ambassador to the United States. So I'm just going to go through one by one. You heard what I had to say about how I think about the future. Tell me where you come out on that and what you're thinking about. So Benedetta, first to you as our esteemed NATO representative.
All right, as the esteemed NATO representative, maybe I'll use my few minutes to ground where we're going and what we're doing at the moment in terms of political and military adaptation. Because I would say that, yes, probably it's 74, almost 75 years that people are discussing the future of NATO. So I take your point, but I think it's without a doubt in recent years, the last couple of years, NATO has entered a historical set of transformation. And it is resetting itself to deal with what it sees as a security environment that it's more dangerous, more complex, more volatile. Essentially, rebuild our ability to do collective defense and to strengthen the ability to do the territorial defense of Europe in light of what we see as the most complex and dangerous security environment, certainly since the end of the Cold War, if not since World War II. So I think there are two main legs to that transformation, and I think if we do, and I'm confident we will do both things right, and if we do, I think we are setting ourselves up for the future of NATO in a very resolute way. Firstly is, of course, as the entire conversation has addressed this morning, is reacting to the fact that the security environment, the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace, that the Euro-Atlantic security system is permanently deteriorated, and then chiefly this is because of the Russia threat. So how do we respond to that? Partly for NATO, of course, this is about completely resetting our military posture. This is a process that started in 2014. I know that this is a quick round of comments, so I will not tell you all the elements, but the long story short, this is a generational reset. Forces, plans, reinforcements, defense spending, investment in rehauling and restructuring our entire industrial ecosystem, and all taken together, I think they send a credible message that our military posture is fit for purpose, and that purpose is a situation in which we have a clear threat, near peer competitor in the Russian Federation, and of course also able to deal with the enduring threats of terrorism. But responding to a deterioration in the Euro-Atlantic security environment and dealing with the Russian threat for NATO is also about working with partners. Because, and I think this is a theme that I've heard throughout the day, Euro-Atlantic stability rests on the stability of the entire Euro-Atlantic area, and that's why NATO attaches such importance to obtaining a result out of which Ukraine will prevail as a sovereign, independent country. This is key for us to moving forward, and that's why the investment in stepping up practical support and upgrading the political relations. And I'm sure we'll talk more about those decisions in Vilnius later. But if that's the first basket, and I think that's the part of NATO's adaptation that's been covered throughout the morning, I also would like to highlight that there is a second parallel process, which is how do we use the alliance as the key convening platform for the political West, for Europe and North America to come together to deal with the broader challenge of strategic competition. And this is not just about Russia. It's about the systemic challenge posed by China. It's about how China and Russia are working together to push back against the rules-based international order. And it's about how we're being threatened and challenged more and more through non-military means as well. So this second transformation of NATO is at its core political, and it's about enhancing resilience. It's about building transatlantic convergence of that China challenge. It's about strengthening partnership. And it's about more and more also understanding, and I'll close here because I know we have to be really quick, but it's also more and more about understanding those security connection and trade-offs between the Euro-Atlantic and the and the Indo-Pacific, which are all themes we haven't addressed so far, but I think if you want to look at the future of an alliance that wants to ensure the freedom and security of basically 1 million members, then we need to tackle strategic competition as seriously as we rebuild our collective defense. So it's the military and the non-military to me.
And let me give you a quick follow-up on your second point, because if NATO is, as the 91 strategic concept said, an essential venue for consultation and the forum for decision on issues bearing on the security and defense commitments of its members under the Washington Treaty. That's the sentence, and that's been there all along. The most important issue affecting the security of NATO allies today is happening to a non-member. So do you have the right forum at NATO for discussing how we deal with that threat to NATO members with the country that is involved?
Well, I think that we made a significant step forward at the summit in Vilnius with upgrading the political relations with Ukraine and with the NATO-Ukraine Council. This is going to have, it's already been used. We used it for the first time in July to discuss the situation in the Black Sea and the very worrisome Russian behavior towards the grains deal. And the point is to have a forum where all the 31 allies, soon to be 32, and Ukraine sit at the table as equals, and in which each of the members at that table can call consultations, including Ukraine. And Ukraine has already used that for that meeting in July. So I think that's a good setup that we can use, and we, in my opinion, should continue using and scaling up in terms of joint decision shaping, information sharing, best practices sharing, lessons learned, and of course decision making. And it's also our vehicle through which to advance Ukraine's membership aspirations. So I think that's a good forum. More broadly, I completely agree with you. This notion, this dimension, this political dimension of NATO as a political platform to convene and forge joint approaches is really going to be more and more important in a world mark of strategic competition. And I will just quote the work we have done a few years ago on understanding the security impact of 5G as one key example of how do we look at resilience issue through a security lens, and the outcome is an alliance that is better coordinated and more secure. So we need to do more of this.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much. I would agree. I think the NATO-Ukraine Council should become one of, if not the preeminent bodies at NATO when it comes to discussing the role of Russia, dealing with Russia, Russian threats, war in Ukraine. Ian Bond. So we've just given a very ambitious look at what NATO might be, or in the future of NATO might be. What are the risks and pitfalls and things to watch out for?
Well, thanks very much, Kurt. Yeah, I slightly have the beating of you. I think I started dealing with NATO 36 years ago.
Oh, my goodness.
And I can confirm that the debates on the future of NATO have been going on at least that long. So I found what Benedetta was saying extremely interesting because it dovetails with some of the things that I am slightly concerned about. And the first of those is about the geographical focus of NATO. The strategic concept is very broad geographically. And here we are, we're faced with an extremely large problem in one part of the alliance, which does not necessarily engage with the threats that some other parts of the alliance perceive as being the most important. And I mean, there's always been an issue there between the East and the South. But I think this has made it probably more acute because actually there's quite a lot going on in the South. You know, in the Cold War, the South was definitely a secondary problem. Now it really isn't. It's, you know, we face a serious problem there. And I do worry that NATO, and I'll come back to the resource question, but I do worry that NATO is under-resourced for all of the issues that it's trying to take on. And one thing that slightly worried me, Benedetta, in what you said or didn't say was, I didn't hear a reference to the European Union, but it seems to me that some of the answer to how you deal with this is through the closer NATO-EU relationship. The second thing is about the enlargement question. So we've talked quite a bit today about Ukraine and enlargement and so on. Vilnius, for me, was disappointing because we basically gave control of the timetable to Vladimir Putin. By saying, in essence, yes, Ukraine can come in, but not until the war is over, you're pretty much giving an incentive to Putin to ensure that in some form, war continues for as long as possible. And I think that NATO has to try to figure out how do you bring Ukraine in, even in circumstances where, in any kind of legal form, this war is not over. I think you also, since we're sitting here in Tbilisi, have to ask yourself, what can we do and what is Georgia doing to be able to meet what we said in the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, which was that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of the alliance. And I do worry that we may have missed a window of opportunity with Georgia. And that the Georgian government now, and I'm sure there will be people here who will say, well, no, you're quite wrong about this, but it seems to me that that we are in a situation where the Georgian government is actually heading in entirely the wrong direction and making it more difficult to foresee the circumstances in which, in any short perspective, Georgia could join. Third thing is European defense budgets. I don't need to say a great deal about this, but I will say this. Just at the moment, having seen the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine, I think that the finance ministries of Europe pose a bigger threat to the future of NATO than the armies of Vladimir Putin. In my own country, which keeps patting itself on the back for the scale of its defense effort, the percentage of GDP that we spend on defense is now lower than it was in 2014. It's still above 2%, but it's above 2% by some margin that you have to look at with a microscope. And in the wider European context, as finance ministries start to reimpose the fiscal disciplines that were relaxed for the COVID pandemic, we face a real crunch where it's very, very hard to see how you find the money to get anywhere close to 2%, let alone the 3% that I think we probably need to deal with the challenges that we face. And then just a final brief point is on US politics, and we touched on this a bit this morning. But I am still worried about the direction of travel, particularly in the Republican Party. You know, I was at NATO in the era of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And, you know, I cannot imagine what has happened to the Republican Party that you now have the, I don't know what you call him really, but the putative nominee of the Republican Party basically having to be talked down in his first term from pulling the US out of NATO. And the trouble is, I don't suppose he will make the mistake in his second term of appointing people like Mattis and McMaster and others who would actually do anything other than say, yes, boss, and here's a way you can do it. So I worry seriously about that. And I wish that I had neat solutions, but I'm going to rely on the other people on this panel to come up with them.
Well, we'll come to Jonas in just a second. So I'm going to summarize divisions between East and South, uncertainty over enlargement and giving the keys to Vladimir Putin, finances for NATO, and US politics. So in summary, the biggest threat to NATO is ourselves.
Yes.
Yes, and I think that's right. I would agree. But someone else has concluded that I'd rather be in NATO than not. And so, you know, after the Napoleonic Wars, Sweden gets a French regent and decides on a policy of non-alignment in war with a view towards neutrality in peacetime, and managed that through the Franco-Prussian Wars, through World War I, through the Balkans Wars, through World War II, even some very difficult decisions during World War II, but maintained this policy for 200 years. And now Sweden changes its policy. So this to me says that something big is going on here. So Jonas, in your own words, describe what Sweden sees and why this is causing a 200-year shift in Sweden's orientation.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you for your nice introduction. You know, I've never been to Georgia before, and I just want to thank Nino and Evelyn and David. Thank you for broadening my wonderful Georgian experience. Kurt, you said I've been posted in Washington. I did that in the 80s and also 2017 to 13. Every time the Americans asked us about if Sweden was going to apply for NATO membership, they all said, if you apply in the morning, you can be members at noon. That hasn't really happened, not due to the Americans, but due to different factors. I think that the February 24th, 22 really changed the European architecture, not just for all of Europe, but especially for Sweden and Finland. And as you said, we just had a few months to go from not being asking for NATO membership to do right that. For Finland, they are now NATO members. For Sweden, we have had a longer way because we have all the EU members has signed our ratification, but we still got Turkey and Hungary still to go. At the Vilnius meeting, there was the commitment between Sweden and Turkey and NATO. And it was a very good one, signed by both of us. We got a handshake from Erdogan. And our agreement is that he is on board. And that will be ratified by the Turkish parliament. They start the process beginning of October. And it's a good program, more or less saying that we will work closely to address Turkey's security concerns. We will expand Sweden's counter-terrorism cooperation against the PKK. We will resume export control from Sweden to Turkey. We will set up a new security compact with annual meetings. We will present a roadmap on our fight against terrorism. Sweden will not provide support to Turkish organizations close to PKK. Sweden and Turkey will step up our economic cooperation, both bilaterally and investments. We have an actively supporting Turkey's efforts to revitalize Turkey's EU accession points, which come as a surprise for us. And of course, we will do that together with other members. And of course, Erdogan said more or less that, yes, I will take this to our parliament and you have a plan from us. My view is better to be late than ever. I think that in the end of the year, we'll probably be a NATO member. One thing that is probably Kurt can answer that, and that is the Turkish-US connection in all of this with F-16 planes. I'm not entitled to do that, but you might probably do that. The reason why Sweden did that, why we have been neutral for that long, especially during the modern time, is because we have Finland between Sweden and Russia and Soviet Union at the time. And because we knew if we had been pushing for a NATO membership and Finland was not on board, that had put them in a much more difficult situation. So we said, we didn't say that publicly, but that was our finding line. Finland has now a wonderful president with Sauli Niinistö, and he has really been pushing this question. It was very good for Sweden. And he said at one interview that we took the experience, Russia's neighborhood policy during the Winter War in the 40s, and also in the 40-45, and they really were trying to capture as much as they could of Finland. They didn't do that. But he said that we should probably have done as the Baltics did in the 90s, applying for NATO membership then. We didn't do that, and that was a grave mistake. And I think that has meant a lot for the Swedish view on why we are now joining Finland.
Yeah. Now, what you didn't talk about in that is what Russia under Putin and Putinism here means for the European security environment and Sweden's place in it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have. But I can come back to that if you
would.
Go
ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, it's true. But if you really come, what does it mean for Sweden to be in NATO? What it means for Finland to be in NATO? This is, I think both Finland and Sweden has equality capabilities to NATO. Finland has a very, very good army, especially their substantial reserves. Sweden has a strong air force and naval force, particularly our submarine forces. Sweden has the advanced Gripen fighters, and if you add the Gripen fighters to the F-35, which is now ordered or under order to Denmark, Norway, and Finland, we will have more than 250 highly modern fighters in our part of Europe. And with Sweden and Finland, NATO membership, the Baltic Sea becomes even a closer NATO lake. And as David said to me today, we better tell the Russians it's safer in the NATO lake than it was before. yes, we have Kaliningrad. Yes, we have St. Petersburg. But I think that NATO countries can dominate both geographically and also military the area. And of course, the most probably important thing is the consequences of Swedish and Finnish accessions to NATO would be to increase NATO's political strength as a pillar of defense of Europe and the transatlantic area. Both countries will, of course, help to facilitate a deeper coordination between EU and NATO. And I think more important is to burden the sharing across the transatlantic. These are our what we can offer and also be part of the umbrella.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is it's less about the threat and more about Sweden's role.
Yeah.
Žygis, so you've been through Soviet occupation, liberation, pushing to get Lithuania to a point of security and inclusion at NATO and the European Union. And I think that Lithuania has been consistent in calling attention to the risks that are still there. And I think we see them play out now in Ukraine. So the Vilnius summit, as many people said earlier, didn't live up to what many wanted to see. What do you think needs to happen at Washington, the Washington summit? How do we prepare to get there? And how does NATO come out of this? How do all of us come out of this with a secure, democratic, prosperous, free Europe?
Well, I will maybe try to speak bluntly, avoiding great political correctness. You know, I was thinking why late Senator McCain established this conference in Georgia, because I think every year when we come, it's a good confrontation with our own conscience. Because Georgia is the result of the biggest Western appeasement, spinelessness, you know, embracing the evil and devil after what was done with Georgia. And we were together in Bucharest NATO summit, and your question was about the future of NATO. Imagine the future of NATO if guys would be listening to Lithuanians and Americans then in Bucharest. Yep. No occupations in Georgia, no occupations in Ukraine, no talks like this. But that future was rejected. So I will be very blunt. If we continue with this strategy of having no strategy, if we continue with this appeasement towards Russia, so we better not celebrate future of NATO in Washington NATO summit, because it will be just, well, maybe celebration of the past. And in this past, I don't see a lot of bright spots, to be honest, because what we did from Bucharest to Vilnius is a shame. It's just a shame. Because instead of creating Europe whole and free, instead of, you know, fighting for values that are enshrined into our constitutions and NATO treaty, we just appeased Russia. And what we did in Vilnius, this is like, we are still under shock in Lithuania, because before Vilnius, we worked so hard in all European capitals to get, first of all, Europeans together, and we did it. Europeans, surprisingly, did this candidate status decision. That is a history. And this year, we will work hard to invite Ukrainians and Moldovans for accession talks. We will do our job, dear Americans. You are always laughing at us that we are, you know, playing it soft, playing it bad. But look to you, America. What you did in Vilnius NATO summit? You've been behaving like Germans and French in Bucharest. You blocked the invitation to Ukrainians. And if this is continuing in Washington, so why do we come to Washington then? To celebrate another convention, you know, and to elect another president who does what? Appease Russia again? And then who is the victim? Us. Because you can sleep, you know, you can actually celebrate your anniversaries. But you know, I remember what one Spanish MP said to Americans after listening to my emotional speech. He said, dear Americans, you better listen to those Baltics, because if not, you will have your own Pearl Harbor. And I think this will be the future of NATO if you will not be listening to us, as you are not listening for us like for 15 years from Bucharest. You will have your own, we will all have our own Pearl Harbor. It will be Russia's war with NATO. Because we with Poles, we will not stand and see like Ukrainians are dying just like that. Just because you decided, or some Sarkozys or others decided that we can, sacrifice those countries. Because, just give another California, give another San Francisco to Russians. That's okay, We want to celebrate NATO's anniversary. So stop it, please. And really, if we do it right, as Kurt said, if we, put the puzzle or some other things, like General said, together after February 24, what we did in Europe, we might create a miracle. The 8th conference of Tbilisi might be a victory conference. We might retake Crimea. This is possible, guys, and this is not about your weapons and money. Forget about it. This is about your brains, about your strategy, about willingness not to be afraid. Because what you do now, what some big Americans do now, they institutionalize nuclear blackmail of Russia. And who is Russia today? Half of Italian economy having some Soviet nukes, and scaring you? This is about deterrence. What about your deterrence? What about your strength? What about Reagan? What about Bush? What about values that helped us to revolt against the Soviets? We did it 30 years ago. Last Soviet soldier left Lithuania because we believed your values. And where are you now, America? In Vilnius, in Tallinn, in Kiev, in Tbilisi still, but not in Washington.
Yeah. Very powerful. Thank you very much, Zigis. And I'm going to open it up to the audience for comments and questions. I may call on a couple people as well, so John Herbst, get ready. And I see lots of hands, which is great. And the one thing I want to say in putting some of these together, I think I heard between Žygis and Jonas, Benedetta, Ian, everybody, there's pieces here that have to come together, as you were saying. There is military capabilities. There is true consultation among all of our concerned partners in security in Europe, members and non-members alike. There is the role that all of us have to play. There is making sure that we have those military capabilities so that we provide deterrence, so that we're not facing wars in Europe. The purpose of this is peace in Europe, but it has to be an inclusive peace. And there is a role for the European Union in how these things fit together to build a prosperous Europe. I think we have to put all of those things on the table together to see the future. And so I think that they come out here in the various shapes. I'm going to call first, since we're in Georgia, on my good friend in the front row, Batu Kutelia, for a Georgian comment.
Thank you. Great panel. Batu Kutelia, Atlantic Council of Georgia. Žygis, you're absolutely right about the brains, and definitely NATO is not a brain dead, though there was some illusions about it. But even more, I think NATO is the only remaining security organization or institution so far globally that is able to defend democracies. Ukraine made a, so I have two questions, one more technical about the resilience and one a little bit a global scope. So Ukraine made a big, bold steps in terms of its resilience reform. Ukraine adopted NATO's 7 baseline resilience requirements starting from 2019. So my question is how even this short but 3-year resilience reform according to the NATO template helped Ukrainians resist at least even the first shock of Russian military aggression. And if it's successful, my next question is, can we use this NATO resilience template as a template for other non-NATO democracies to be adopted? So increasing NATO's global role in terms of deterring the aggression from authoritarians.
Okay, that sounds like a question for Benedetta, and I know you wanted to come in on another point as well, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. No, first of all, I'll start with this question because I think it's very, very important. And indeed, this has been a very, I think, significant area of cooperation between NATO and Ukraine based on those 7 baseline requirements, which are broad guidelines that tell us what do we need to do in order to remain resilient in peacetime, crisis, and war. And they span across sectors from the health sector to the governmental sector to transportation. So I think that has been a very important area of cooperation and one which indeed now we're looking more and more through the template of how can we put resilience at the center of our practical cooperation with partners, especially those who are vulnerable to external aggression and interference. And I think but I would just reframe a little bit what you said in the sense that I think it's without question that both the military assistance training to Ukrainian armed forces and the work on issues as resilience has contributed and has helped in the Ukrainian performance. But I would also say it's really, this is mostly, first and foremost, a testament to Ukraine and to their ability to really take those resilience lessons and mainstream it across their societies. And to the point where I will say today, we are the ones who have a lot to learn from Ukraine in terms of how to resist aggression, how to counter disinformation, the notion of really whole of society approach to building resilience and countering aggression. I would say, rather than, I don't look at this as something that Ukraine has learned from NATO, but I really think that it's a mutual conversation these days. But I agree with you that in the future, as we think about the future of conflict, there are so many lessons that we're learning from Ukraine, and one of them is really how do we build that connection with our societies and our citizens so that they're invested from day one. And it doesn't have to be that everybody has a military role, but everybody has a role to play when we're talking about countering aggression that comes from the kinetic to the non-kinetic spectrum. So I think that's a really important point to highlight, and one where we really want to deepen the relation. I just wanted to have a quick reaction to the point that I think, provocative statement that if we don't pick up the pace, we might not have anything to celebrate in DC, in Washington, where we meet for the 75th anniversary. I would say I do understand very well why making the question of Ukraine one of the central ones. I understand the political and strategic rationale for it, but I think we shouldn't do it to the detriment of sending indirectly the wrong deterrent signaling. And that wrong deterrent signaling will mean to say that NATO has been doing nothing. That is not the case. Today, NATO has rebuilt in its ability to do collective defense in a way that it hadn't done in 40 years. The number of battle groups, including in Lithuania, on our eastern flank, including in Lithuania, is now able to scale up to brigade size. The number of prepositioned equipment and material and enablers is increasing. The number of exercises is increasing. We have agreed for the first time since the end of the Cold War regional plans that assign forces to territory. We have a reform of our NATO response force that will enable Secure to have up to 300,000 troops at higher readiness level. Of course, getting it right on Ukraine is essential, but let's not make the argument that everything that we're doing that is ultimately ensuring that Article 5 is rock solid, that Russia is deterred from attacking the alliance. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater and inadvertently send the wrong signal. NATO today is stronger than it has been for decades and will continue to do so. And still we need to get Ukraine right, but it's not either or.
Yeah.
Just
very good point.
Very
good point. Zhygi says 2 fingers here, but quick. Okay.
I remember what happened after 2 months of this spineless in Bucharest NATO summit. Russia invaded Georgia. The ability of Lithuanian is a bit different from those nice civilized Europeans. We see the world through Russian eyes as well. And now I just think what Putin thinks about this weakness showed in Vilnius. And if this is repeated in Washington, everything that was created by Bill Clinton, Bush, and all those great presidents might go into ashes, because we will go to war. So think about that before celebrating it in Washington.
All right, Žygis, thank you. Here in the second row, please. And introduce yourself, please.
Yes, certainly. Good afternoon. My name is Anna Dolidze. I'm a professor of law, and as well as a Georgian politician here for the People Party, and a former Deputy Minister of Defense. More of a comment in relation to the theme of the talk and perhaps the conference. First of all, thank you to the McCain Institute for the support of Georgian sovereignty for year after year. But a comment and a theme that I hope the conference will take upon, not only at this panel, but later as well. A very important a theme, a topic, and a subject that has very, very serious emotional traction and a possibility to be utilized against the strength of the Russian information warfare. So in the realm of soft power, in the realm of working and winning hearts and minds of the peoples in Eastern Europe, as well as subjugated by the Russian Empire or former Soviet Union. And that's the idea of decolonization. Colonization, decolonization. I know that it has had traction in the West, including NATO, but I don't think it has had enough traction, because one of the also periods of time which could have been used by the United States and the West, and I've spent many years in the United States, by the way, for my studies there, and forever grateful, but is the 90s, where there was a serious decolonization moment here in the realm of former Soviet Union, and unfortunately, due to geopolitics, this moment was lost. Really, there was a great, as many of you know, a moment of eruption of great energy across republics. And I think this moment is taking place right now with the Ukrainian war. And I think whether or not this is explicated to people, it is by local actors like me. People feel it themselves. And this is what gets traction here in North Caucasus, South Caucasus, and everywhere else. So I hope the intellectual aspect of the Western machinery, NATO, EU, North America, pays attention to this concept more closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to summarize that in short form, because I need to remember these things. This is a moment, and we had better rise to the moment, not sink to what's comfortable. John Herbst has been leading a process trying to get American strategists and thinkers to come together around a set of recommendations. He has done remarkable, remarkable work and effort at this, and he's, I think, come to a philosophical impasse. And so, John, I want you to address Žygis here, who has called for Washington needs to be the place where we invite Ukraine to join NATO. Why go to the party if there's nothing to celebrate? John, why don't you speak to this?
What I've learned in 9 years at the Atlantic Council, trying to push Washington and the West more broadly to pursue a stronger policy to defeat not just Kremlin aggression in Ukraine or Georgia, but revisionism more broadly, which will come to our NATO allies if we let it, is that there's nothing better in dealing with people who don't understand the problem than surprise. For that reason, I don't want to go into my current project. Well, I shouldn't say my current project, because it's a project of about 45 people. What I will say, though, in response to Kurt's question is this. We need to make sure that NATO takes a strong step forward towards Ukrainian membership in Washington. That strong step has to be one that's achievable in current circumstances. I am certain we can do a lot better than the alliance did in Vilnius. But it has to be done in a way that avoids obvious traps, which could in fact thwart the effort for a major gain. You have to be careful about shooting too high if you're not confident that even those who normally you can count on for support are going to be with you. And for that, you need nuance as well as boldness. And with that, I'll say no more. But you'll be hearing more from our group within the next several weeks. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to come back to the panel at the end here. I've got the 10-minute signal from David Kramer. I see, okay, I promised our young colleague in the center here.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Garsami, and what I want to say is that while you're talking about NATO expansion, what Russia did in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, what is similar? The similar is that they set political time bombs in those regions. For example, Donbass and Luhansk in Ukraine, Transnistria and Moldova, and of course, the so-called breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia. The reason they did this is because they don't want these countries joining NATO, and if it wasn't for Abkhazia and South Ossetia, we would have most likely joined NATO in 2008. And Russia did everything so Georgia couldn't join, maybe blackmail them with Russian gas and even start a war. And they committed heavy war crimes such as bombing a military hospital in Gori. But the thing is, they said that the separatists did it, the South Ossetian separatists, even though there were practically Russian troops in South Ossetian uniforms. My question to you is, what could NATO do about these political time bombs that prevent countries from becoming NATO members? Because in the NATO, there's certain rules in NATO that says that if a country wants to join, they have to have, their borders must not have issues such as breakaway republics. So what could NATO do about this?
Thank you very much. And thank you for your question. Thank you for your engagement. Keep at it. We need the next generation. And we'll come back to that. So remember, what can NATO do? And I'll add a comment on that as well. Okay, is it Georgi? Okay.
Georgian military spending is 1.6% of GDP, actually, for you to remember. Georgia has long relinquished NATO membership as a political priority of its foreign policy. And this culminated in Georgian Prime Minister blaming the war in Ukraine on NATO very recently. Don't you think that Georgia's friends somehow failed to recognize this shift, which took place long ago, enabled this gradual slide of which Prime Minister's statement was a culmination? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's the Georgia question. That's the Georgia question, and I think it would be good actually to hear any thoughts people have about that. One more from the audience here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you, Irina Arabidze. I'm a visiting lecturer at the Caucasus University. So my question
please say all that again.
Irina Arabidze, I'm a visiting lecturer at the Caucasus University in Tbilisi. My question regards the discussion about winning the war and winning the peace in the Ukrainian context and NATO's role in that. So one of the prerequisites that is mentioned often is the ironclad security guarantees for Ukraine, and there are broadly two options that are being mentioned. One, membership in NATO, and the bilateral security guarantees that the United States could provide. So my question to the panel is, which one is more likely and which one is more desirable? Thank you.
So the question of separate security guarantees rather than NATO membership. So I'll let the panel come back and pick up the ones of these that they want to address. I'll say a few words in wrapping up as well. So,
Reverse order?
Sorry?
Reverse order?
Reverse order.
Yes.
Ziggy's.
Okay, I'll make it very brief. There is no future without leadership. And if this leadership is not shown by Americans, who are very important NATO member, NATO has no future. Because it has a conflict of such a magnitude, because it will not be conflict on the Eastern fronts. I'm just from Taiwan. You will also have another great conflict, because China is learning from what you do and how do you react. So I think this is serious, guys. This is like, I have a feel like 39. We still drink wine, we still smile, we celebrate something, but we are on the edge of collapse, of Armageddon if we do nothing. At the same time, if we do one thing only, Ukrainian invitation in Washington, we will fix it all. And if not, we will defeat Americans like yesterday in basketball.
All right, Jonas.
Now, I just come back to the question of NATO and support for democracy. In Sweden, we had this NATO before we applied for membership. It was divided between the center-right and the center-left. The center-right got around 30%, the center-left got 70%. There was no way we could communicate between the two. After we applied, and what we are now doing with the support for NATO is 70%, 7-0. And all of a sudden, they see what NATO is doing, not just for us up in the northern part, but also what they are doing up in Ukraine, and support for democracy and the impact for the public opinion. I'm surprised and I'm positive to see that we can use that much better in the future.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, Ian.
Yeah. The question about about Abkhazia and South Ossetia and so on. I mean, I think it is worth worth looking at what NATO did when it took in the Federal Republic of Germany in 1955. You don't have to give up your claims to your territory, but it does not automatically have to be the case that NATO extends its umbrella to every part of the territory that you regard as being yours. I'm oversimplifying, but basically in 1955, the German constitution had a rather expansive definition of what might be Germany. NATO did not say, well, that means that we've got to go to war over the GDR. So that's one point. The point about Georgia and its Western friends, I think, is very important. And I think one of the problems is that Georgia has sort of dropped a bit off the map for a lot of Western ministers. It used to get a lot of attention, and partly because this is an awkward government that we don't really like and that doesn't really share our values, we probably don't talk to them as much as we should. And that's probably something that we need to put right. And then the last point was the one about security guarantees. I mean, I think the answer is that there is nothing better than a NATO security guarantee. But unless the US is prepared to offer you a bilateral guarantee, that's already a necessary condition for being able to move in the direction of a NATO guarantee. And I don't see the current administration or any likely Republican candidate offering the kind of guarantee that, say, South Korea benefits from. I wish I could. Maybe, Kurt's going to tell me that things are different from how I see it. But at the moment, I just don't see a willingness to offer that sort of firm support backed up by 30,000 troops or whatever it is in Korea.
Okay, Benedetta.
I'll be very quick. First of all, on the membership, I agree. It is fundamentally a political decision. If you go to the North Atlantic Treaty and you read the open door policy, it's abundantly clear there is not a checklist. So that means that the margin of maneuver, if there is political will and a strategic interest, is there. So in that sense, it's not a prerequisite. So I completely agree with that. Sometimes we forget how political, and in the best sense of the word, in the sense of strategic, it should be a commitment to the strategic outlook of a country and the Euro-Atlantic family as a whole membership is. So in that sense, I think it's important to make that point. In terms of the tool NATO has to support Euro-Atlantic aspiration of its partners, including Georgia, I think it's very important that we continue to maintain political dialogue, that we continue to maintain attention to what, for the Allies, is very clear, another set of democratic reforms that NATO expects to see to progress forward on the membership track, but at the same time, I will also underline the importance of continuing the political dialogue, the practical cooperation, and really remembering that from an alliance point of view, and this is something we agreed in our strategy, in our strategic concept, this region is of strategic importance to us and to peace and stability of the broader Euro-Atlantic area, so we should never forget it, and I think it should be a driving principle as we approach our relationship with Georgia, no matter what. And finally, just to disabuse you, I can promise you the summits are not fun. We do not party. It's not a reason to celebration. It's a reason to keep the work going and keep allies up to the promise to what they say they want to do. So for us, it's how to move forward. It's certainly, and in that sense, I do agree with you very much so. The worst possible thing for us to do now would be to be complacent. And I can guarantee that maybe we will have a glass of wine, maybe, but the point of the summit is not to celebrate, is to get going with the work.
Glass of wine with Ukrainians.
Yeah.
We invite
With
them.
Ukrainians.
Yeah,
Okay. Now I'm going to close this out. I see David hovering, and I think I have 2 minutes. And so first off, what can NATO do about the time bombs that Russia has planted? And my answer to that is each of these time bombs, the South Ossetia or the Tzhinvali region, Abkhazia, Transnistria, etc., these are all manifestations of a bigger problem. And if we don't tackle these individually, we're just going to get bogged down in these. We have to deal with the big problem. And that's where I appreciate your former Deputy Defense Minister here saying that this is a moment in time that doesn't come around very often. Europe is in the midst of the biggest war in Europe with the greatest number killed and the number of refugees since World War II. And yet we are acting as though we're still in the same framework that we were in 10 years ago.
Exactly.
And I think we need to actually see that this is a different moment, and we need to rise to that moment. And I will give you my summary of what that means real quick. First, victory. There has to be a Ukrainian victory. Second, consolidation. With that victory, we have to consolidate the free world where it exists again, Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, wherever. Third, establish deterrence so that we are not fighting this again in the future. So that is what Benedetta is saying, but inclusive of these territories. Fourth, accountability. We will not have peace with Russia if Russia denies that it has been involved in aggression and genocide and war crimes. There has to be accountability. And fourth, whatever happens inside Russia is for Russians to figure out. But we must insist that they live within their own borders, that there's no special pass for Russia to occupy parts of other people's countries. So that's my formula for where I think the future of NATO has to end up, and that will bring us back to a period of sustained peace, security, freedom, prosperity in Europe. So with that, thank you very much. Thanks to the panel. Great job, everyone.